going to kick it over to Jeff Penz. Some of you know Jeff, perhaps from the last time he was on Cup of Joe. Jeff covers the international markets for Ryerson, so our importing strategies. He also covers the scrap and secondary markets for Ryerson. So I'm going to kick it over, Jeff. Take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks for the return invite. So we'll see if we can do this again. I'm going to mainly focus on the carbon market. I will touch a little bit on aluminum because there's some new developments on the import front. But one of the things that I'm going to take us through a bunch of factors that we've kind of considered and more or less try and paint a picture of what's happened over the past year and how did we get to where we are and kind of where things are looking like they're going. And part of understanding import is understanding the domestic option that you have at the same time. So I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit between both, but factors to consider are lead times, domestic mill utilization rates, scrap, geopolitical economic environment, which is a long way of saying government, ocean freight, futures market, and price. So I'm going to jump into each of those ones and talk a little bit more. So throughout 2022, what we saw was the domestic mills, their lead times started getting shorter and shorter. And in a typical market, lead times for hot rolled, they're about a month, about 4 weeks. We saw that even shorter than that during 2022. Domestic lead times currently are sitting at just over 2 months. So they're really stretching the bounds. Now, that is important because by comparison, foreign mills are about 4 to 5 months from when you place an order. So if you're thinking about that in terms of your own consumer, going and shopping, you're going to be buying something today. You're going to lock in a price today that you're going to get 5 months from now. So you really have to be sure, is that going to be a good deal by the time it arrives? Moving on to the next thing that we consider is the mill's utilization rate. And the utilization rate is really a measure of their capability to produce against what they're actually putting out the door. So during the peak of the pandemic, some mills were running as high as 90%. That is considered about as good as a mill can do. Now, all of the distributors, and I say all, I'm generalizing here, but most distributors in 2022, they kind of saw this declining market, lead times getting shorter, prices coming down. There was this expectation that Q1 of 23 wasn't going to be as robust as what we had seen previously. So a lot of distributors took their order book down and committed less tons to the domestic mills. Now, why is that important? Because right now they're running at 75% of capacity. So the mills have the ability to ratchet up and increase supply, but they're more or less affecting supply by running at a lower capacity. So, more tons at a higher price is good business than, less tons at a higher price than more tons at a lower price. So that's something that's, yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, just to interrupt you there, I guess a question for you. Pre-COVID and maybe a couple of years prior to that, the United States would have had, let's say, 8 to 10 big primary steel mill, at least steel mill brands. Now we're sitting maybe four to six.
Right.
That oligopoly or that concentration of the supply side, not to make an OPEC reference, but certainly there is a power shift that's been given to that smaller grouping by way of acquisition. Do you think that that's kind of the new normal, that they're just going to kind of flex their muscles and when they need to tighten things up from a supply side? And
I would love to think that, but the old analogy that your chain is only strong as its weakest link. As long as you have one player that's willing to move the needle and take an order, that is sort of the spark that lights the either the uptick or the downtick in a market. And I will say, from a discipline standpoint, from my perspective, they're much more disciplined now than we've seen ever in the past. And I think that having less players is a major factor that contributes to that.
Yeah, fair.
So scrap, Nick mentioned one of the things I also look after is scrap for the company and recycling. So what I wanted to just show was this picture, and these are the Chicago busheling, heavy melt and shredded numbers that are published in the AMM each month. And I went back to 2020. And what's interesting here is that if you look at the numbers, we sort of peaked in March and April of 22. And then from March and April of 22 through December, it was pretty much this decline in scrap pricing. Now, why is that important? Well, the next point there, Nick, the majority of the mills in the US are EAFs, electric arc furnaces, and they're fed by busheling scrap. So the product that they're making, scrap is a major factor. It's a major component of the finished price of those goods. If scrap was falling, lead times were coming down, everyone looks into their crystal ball and says, hey, what do we think next year is going to be? No one wanted to go long. No one wanted to take a position and say, this is going to just turn around and get really good. So it kind of explains why we're in the situation we're in today. And it's just, scrap is such a major component. It's the largest cost, I guess, next to energy of producing new steel. Continuing on with scrap, one of the things that we look at, and headlines are great, they can tell you a story or you have to interpret them yourselves, but Turkey is a major buyer of US scrap, and they buy export scrap via ocean deep sea vessels. And these are some of the headlines that have come up just in the past week. Turkish steelmakers resume deep sea purchases at much lower prices. The second one is interesting because Turkish scrap, the demand is under pressure from increasing local supply. Now you might say, okay, so what changed? Well, the earthquake is what changed. One of the interesting things when there is a natural disaster is it usually sparks rebuilding and growth, and it almost acts as a bit of a stimulus. When you look at Turkey, there's actually a huge component now of local scrap that's being produced because of all the rebar and everything else that's in the rubble that's being pulled out. So they've had less demand to go to the US to buy scrap. So that's putting downward pressure on scrap pricing. And as you can see, the pricing, there's some fatigue in the market there as a result of that. Global scrap market's down on bearish sentiment and weak steel demand. So these are all things that are contributing to, the prices and the future out. All right, and so geopolitical, just like I said, a fancy way of saying government involvement. So when you're buying import, you have to think about things like tariffs and duties. A lot of people on the call will be familiar with Section 232. This was enacted as a threat to national security. This started out with a 10% tariff on aluminum, 25% on stainless and carbon. A lot of countries have migrated to this TRQ, which is a tariff rate quota. And essentially what the government did is they said, okay, we're going to look at a historic level of imports. We're going to allow you to bring in a historic amount without a tariff on it. Anything above and beyond that will be subject to the 10% and the 25%. Then there's Section 301, which was really targeted at China for intellectual property, which adds another 7.5% to 15% to 25%, depending on the item. Then you get into anti-dumping. That's when a foreign country sells material into your country cheaper than they sell it in their home market. Then there's countervailing duties. These are subsidies the foreign mill receives from the government or is allowed to produce that are an unfair advantage. These are things that you have to take into account when you're bringing in import material, because depending on what country it is, what mill it is, there are just a vast array of different amounts and duties and tariffs that apply in different situations. Now, this is where I'm going to touch on aluminum. Bringing material into the US, you have to declare it in the ACE portal, which is the automated commercial environment. On April the 1st, any aluminum coming in from Russia is now subject to a 200% additional fee. I mean, that's absolutely huge. I mean, that has completely shut the door. But what's really interesting about that is the government has taken it a step further through this ACE portal, where you actually now have to declare the country of smelt, your largest smelt and second largest smelt. So if a company in a country that's allowed to bring material into the US was buying Russian aluminum before April the 10th, they would have been able to buy ingot from Russia, melted in their own country. It becomes product of that new country, and they could bring it in. Now, if it says Russian smelt, even if it's secondary amount, if there's just a trace element, that'll be 200% duty on that, on top of what you paid. So take
So
whatever
Jeff,
number you are. Yeah.
So Jeff, question for you on that. I assume we've got a lot of buyers of finished product. Maybe they're not buying ingots, but they're buying finished product. They don't know maybe, or they don't care where the ingot is produced, or they haven't historically thought about where the ingot is produced.
Right.
Who would you recommend they go to even get clarity on something like that, or what would you say is the process you would recommend somebody who just wants to investigate if they've got issues? They've got, they might be standing on a landmine that's coming to the United States right now. How would you recommend that process?
So that's an interesting question, because it's really going to depend on what it is. And finished goods are much different than what we're bringing in, because we're bringing in material to be made into finished goods. So there are different classifications, and each one is determined by the HS code, or harmonized tariff code, that's used to clear that into entry. So my recommendation, if you want to look it up, is to go to Google, type in the product that you're bringing in. That'll bring you to a US trade website for CBP. You can type in the type of product that you have. It'll show you a list of various HS codes that can apply to it. You have to really read through, because things like, I'll give you an example, the width of the material can affect it, the thickness of the material, the chemical composition can affect it. So you have to really narrow it down to which bucket does this apply to. And I know it's a bit of a vague answer, but it's really, there are so many possibilities. You have to look at it at an item by item basis. But the government, the CBP website is a very good resource for doing that.
And also some riveting bedtime stories in there, I'm sure, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and then just for good measure, they threw an extra 70% on most unwrought semi-finished goods out of Russia. So you're looking at 270%. That all is taking effect. We're April the 6th today. So in 4 days, the new 200% on primary and the 70% already went into effect on April 1st. So it's a lot of things going on, a lot of things to take into account when you're factoring in import.
Hey, question from the audience, Jeff, and possibly even Nick. Have aluminum prices reacted to the Russian tariffs at all?
I would say they've already reacted to the Russian tariffs, because if you think back when the war broke out in 22, the government basically said, we don't want aluminum coming in from Russia. At that time, I think I remember seeing a statistic that Russia had something like 13%, and Nick could probably correct me on that, but 13% of the world's aluminum supply. Most of that is down to very little now. I mean, anyone who was using Russian aluminum in the United States basically has got away from that. So I feel like that's already built in. What it's probably going to do more than anything is catch some people that aren't aware of where their material's really coming from.
Yeah, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. The ACE portal and these applicable tariffs, those are just for the United States, or is this?
Correct. Each country has their own, but that's for goods coming into the United States. So whether they went into Canada first, went into Mexico, and came up, the moment they cross the border into the United States, the government's looking at that. So it's not like you could say, hey, I'll send it over here and then it'll be fine. The moment it crosses the border, it's getting hit.
The reason why I wanted to point that out is just because, and it may take time to reroute supply chains, but there are going to be nations who still want aluminum. And if it's Russian and they're not in the United States, so be it, they'll probably still buy it. So that would likely make a more muted impact. Now, it's going to impact things in the United States, and perhaps in the short term, it's going to impact Russia's ability to export and sell aluminum in the short term. But my gut would say there will be nations who will step up and say, well, one man's trash is another man's trash.
It's funny you say that, because one of your comments earlier was about Russia's GDP increasing and things like that. And we sit here saying, how is that possible? We're buying less and less all the time. Well, countries like India and Pakistan are buying oil, and they're buying aluminum, and they're buying other things. And I don't mean to pick on those two countries, but there are countries out there that say, hey, just because it's bad for the US doesn't mean it's bad for me. And, some people may kick that moral argument to the side and go with the pricing. So that does happen, absolutely. And then ocean freight, I guess the last time we talked, there was nothing but lineups of ships. You couldn't get containers, prices were out to lunch, and everything's better now. Well, yes and no. So now that we have less ships, less transportation, you're waiting a bit longer. The price has come down, but you can't always get the container that you want. 45 footers are still in very short supply. And, it's just waiting for that ship. If there's less vessels, you can't always be releasing them when you want to. So your goods are sitting on the dock a little bit longer, or they're going on a feeder vessel trying to get to where they need to go just to build that load. Then over to, oh, sorry, if I could add one more comment there. Exactly, that was the more transloading and handling is involved. So the futures market, this one here, there's the crystal ball in the bottom corner. For anyone who doesn't know, a future is a derivative financial contract that obligate parties to buy and sell an asset at a predetermined future date and price. So in English, they really allow you to buy something at a future value, but they provide a window into what we think is going to happen. Now, if we look at hot rolled coil futures by month, you can see right now, we're very close to what is considered the peak. And this is based on what people are willing to buy and what people are willing to sell on this calendar. So remember at the beginning, I said, you're probably going to wait 5 months from when you place a purchase order for that material to come in. If you move down the scale 5 months, it's a pretty good indication that that might not be worth what it is today. Now, the one thing I can guarantee about this chart is it's wrong. Because it won't line up like this exactly when we overlay reality with what the future is, but it's a very good indicator on what is expected to happen. It's directionally valid, as they say. So let's take a look at pricing over the past year. We can see, hot rolled prices were, up to $1,493. Since then, they've come down $340 off of that, but they're up $535 from the low in December of 22. Again, we saw that curve where pricing just continued to drop on the scrap chart, and more or less the products all followed suit. And this compares with, the price of hot rolled in China. Now, the Chinese price, it doesn't have freight or duty or tariff or transportation or all of that, but this is where you have to really start evaluating what is my price today based on when I can get it, what is my price from import based on when I can get it, and what are all those factors of cost that are going to go into that to make the decision. So once you've done all of that, you've looked at it, compared your import offers, looked at the ETAs, factored in futures, scrap it, market utilization, shipping costs, geopolitical. And this is for all the people, I guess, under 40 on the call who can Google this afterwards. I said, in the infamous words of Harry Callahan, do you feel lucky? And well, do you? And that's a little bit of what import is like right now, trying to figure out where we are in the cycle and where it will be by the time it comes in.
I think the version of this quote that I know better is from Jim Carrey's The Mask. I don't know if you know that.
That's a few years after
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you got a few years on me, Jeff.
Yes.
But hey, really appreciate everything.